The subject that we are discussing is maybe the one that is most pertinent to the main theme of this conference, which is how does the war end? And the answer has always been, from the beginning of the conflict, that the war ends when the Russians understand that they can't win. When the Russians understand that Ukraine is an independent country, that it will choose its own future, that it will be part of Europe, that it is not part of Russia. And unfortunately, we have not yet reached that level of understanding in Moscow. And I've argued from the beginning of the war, there are many ways to convince Moscow of this, that it cannot win the war and that it will not dominate Ukraine. And there are economic methods, and there are media methods, and there are military methods. And this panel is going to talk about all of them. Each panelist is going to take a slightly different view. We're clearly at a moment when, for multiple reasons, the president of Russia still thinks he can win. So he's still talking and thinking about winning the war. He's not interested in a ceasefire. President Zelensky this morning spoke about the role that private companies are still playing, Chinese companies, others around the world in supplying Russia. So there are still supply chains that can be cut off. The Russians still are still managing to sell their resources around the world. All of us saw a few days ago a meeting of the world's autocrats in China. And so we saw President Putin being also built up by a team of other autocracies. So we need to think about not only how we convince Russia that they can't win the war, but we begin to break up some of those alliances. And anyway, that's the subject of this panel. And you have the names of the panelists. I'll introduce them as we go. I'd say, interestingly, they come from, we have Britain, we have France, we have Lithuania as a near neighbor of Ukraine, and we have the United States. So that is the spectrum of the Democratic Alliance that is fighting not just Russia, but the autocratic alliance. And so I will also ask them to talk about the world from their national perspectives as well as their areas of expertise. I'm going to start with Gabriel Attal, who's the former French Prime Minister. What are we missing in terms of economic pressure on Russia? So where are the missing tools? What can we do that we're not doing now? What are the mistakes that have been made until now?
Well, I think we are doing a lot, but we can do more and better. There's no magic wand or iron bullet. What we need is some sort of a systematic choke. We need to be more methodical, and I think we need to aim more precisely. I remember last year someone here was saying we almost have as many sanction packages than iPhone models. And I think it happened this year. So I think the idea is not having a new sanction package. We can always get new sanctions, but we have to be more efficient on the thing that hurts the most. And I think it's energy. I think we can do more on energy. We can keep on lowering the price cap. I think it's $47.5. We can keep on reducing it. I think we should be more efficient on the third countries refining Russian oil, especially China and India, which is quite complicated because we have ties with them. But I think some discussions were made between allies to get to do so. I think we have to be more efficient against the shadow fleet and the shadow vessels, port bans. We can do more about that. And I also think we have to help more the Ukrainians to take down Russia's oil refining system. This summer, I think one intervention took down almost 20%, I think it was 17% of Russia's oil refining system. So I think we have to help them to do so because it's what's hurting the most. It means long-range missiles, intelligence, drones, of course. But to be very blunt, I think these are the ideas.
The shadow vessels. This is. I mean, it's interesting actually because what you just said combines actually economic and military pressure. So you're suggesting a package of both that would put pressure specifically on Russian oil. The shadow vessels until now, for those of you who don't know, these are the oil tankers that travel around the world, but also in the Baltic Sea under a strange mix of flags. I don't know, Liberian or Bahamian or something. And so there has been a suggestion. I know it's quite current now, especially in Scandinavia, that they should be stopped, that they should be checked, and that they should be not permitted passage. And there's even some suggestion of perhaps damaging them in other ways. It's been controversial because these are large boats full of oil. But is it something you could imagine France supporting, that the EU supporting?
Well, I think we should. And I saw many things amongst the last 3 years that many people said we wouldn't be supporting, and that we ended up supporting. If we say we are not efficient enough, we have to see where we are not efficient enough, and we have to be more efficient in these areas. And so these vessels get us less efficient. I think we managed to lower the increase of these vessels and of the oil traveling. Now we have to get a decrease. So we have to, I think, go in that direction. Can the EU and France support this? I think so.
You could imagine a majority in the EU in favor of that.
I could. I think, of course, countries in the world benefit from these vessels. But I think we have to look at the effects of stopping them and then help countries who would be in difficulty.
Minister Landsbergis, the former foreign minister of Lithuania, you're a Baltic country. How do you envision pressure on Russia, beginning with, perhaps you could begin with also the question of oil and shadow vessels, and continue further?
Well, thank you so much for the question. My answer became much easier after Prime Minister Attal mentioned hitting oil refineries, because with that I wanted to start. That if we want to sanction, Ukrainians showed how to do it. 20% in roughly 2 weeks, basically Europe was unable to achieve that. We would still have Hungarian veto, and we would be discussing, how to approach that. I think that we should drop the naivete and admit the fact that this war, unfortunately, will not be solved in a diplomatic room. It will be solved in the battlefield. And Ukrainians are showing just how to do it. Develop your technology. If you cannot depend on your allies as much as you would like to, develop your own technology and hit your enemy where it hurts. They did not ask for permission. They don't even, expect to apologize. They are just doing what needs to be done. And that's an excellent, excellent lesson for all of us. Now, I think that what needs to be underscored is that in this context, the aggressive actions of Russia against Poland is also connected to this. It tells a couple of things as to what Putin wants to test and wants to achieve. So first of all, what he wanted to test, I think that he wanted to test American reaction, whether there would be one. And what he wants to achieve, he wants to check whether we are able to win the war, not in Ukraine, but actually now in Poland. That is where we are, ladies and gentlemen. We are trying to figure out how to win a war militarily in Poland for the skies. If we are unable to do that, if we are unable to defend Poland so that Polish people, Baltic people, whoever is on the eastern flank are safe and secure, he will know that we will not lift a finger in Ukraine. That damages us, that damages Ukraine. So unfortunately, he pushed the red line further. And if we don't understand that yet, I'm sorry, but we might be in a very big trouble. So that means that we push him out of Poland and continue pushing out of Ukraine militarily with any means that are necessary.
Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister of Britain, is there a particular British view of this? I mean, you've just heard about military pressure, economic pressure, pressure on Russia's oil industry. What can you contribute?
I think what needs to happen now, if I can just make a political point, is we've seen them. We've had the meeting in Alaska, which was obviously fairly emetic to behold, vomit-inducing, right? The contact has been made. I think the single most powerful message that Putin could now hear from the President of the United States would be, listen, Vladimir Vladimirovich, you've just got to understand that, much as I may like you, I'm ventriloquizing the President of the United States now. Much as I may appear to have been even-handed about this matter, I can't be. Ukraine is a free, sovereign, independent country. They're fighting for their independence. We in America once fought for our independence. We know what it's like. We're going to back these people all the way. And he needs to hear that, because he hasn't heard anything. He hasn't heard anything at all from Biden. He hasn't heard a message from Trump like that. And I think that would make a huge, huge difference. And I actually think the President of the United States could be encouraged to say something like that America is going to be with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And I think that would make it that would be something that I think could be a game changer. Because you need, as somebody was saying earlier, you need to change Putin's strategic goals. Yeah, he needs to realize he's on a loser. And so, look, I agree with what everybody has said, what Gabriel has said about economic sanctions. We clearly need more of them. We need to be doing the secondary sanctions. Frankly, I'd send these shadow boats down to Davy Jones' locker if it was me. One of them should be sunk pour encourager les autres. Why are we still buying uranium? The British government is still buying uranium from Russia. We could be much, much tougher on that. And we still, on the economic front, I mean, I agree totally with what you just said about Minister Landsbergis about the military pressure. But on the economic front, there's one thing, as I said this morning, we still haven't done. I come to this thing every year, and I say the same thing. There's $250 or $300 billion sitting in a Belgian bank account, a Euroclear bank account, and we still, it's a huge amount of money. It's game-changing for Ukraine. Give that money, unfreeze it, give it to Ukraine, and allow them to use it to do whatever they want, buy weapons, fund their war effort, buy more drones, on the understanding that they will repay it to Russia in the event of Russia giving reparations for the damage they've done. I think that's the plan. I've got a my special expert in the front row, Hugo Dixon, who knows all about this. You've got to ask Hugo about this afterwards. He knows all the legal details. But that's what we need to do. Why haven't we done it? It's pure.
And what's the answer?
Well, I don't know. I mean, tragically, I'm no longer prime minister, so I'm no longer able. I'm no longer able to hold the Belgian feet to the fire. What is going on with Euroclear in Brussels? It's absolutely absurd. Why don't we do it? Gabriel, you got any idea?
Actually, I have heard the explanation, but I'd love to hear it from you.
No, and it's quite a difficult question in France, because the official position of the president of France, and I was his prime minister, is still that it would not be possible to seize and use the frozen assets, but that we should keep on using the interest of these assets. No, but I'll come to try to explain why, because my position is clear on that, and with the French Parliament, we just passed a resolution asking for the French government, the French president, and the European Commission to go on seizing these assets and deliver them to Ukraine.
Gabriel, we're not proposing to seize or confiscate these assets. Legally, it's very, very important. And we could reassure all the lawyers and the finance ministries all panicking. All we're doing is allowing the Ukrainians to borrow them against future Russian reparations for the war damage. They're just borrowing it.
I know Hugo Dixon's proposal, and I know how it's presented. What I'm saying is that you've got some legal experts of somehow saying that even if we do that, it's like seizing them. I disagree with them, and you have legal experts saying completely the opposite, and Hugo could talk about it even more. And I was very happy to see that Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission's president, just in her State of the Union speech, just mentioned this proposal, and actually, I think, supported this proposal in order to get this money to the Ukrainians. So I think we are moving on. There are still some countries against it. The Belgians are against it, Germans too.
So the interesting thing for me, actually, is that the reason, as I understand it, the main reason why the assets haven't been seized in a more definitive way, although we are using the interest, is really the same as the reason why sanctions haven't been fully applied, in this sense that both France and Germany and some other countries are worried about backlash against their own companies. They're worried about, in the case of oil, they're worried about backlash against their own industry. You still see Europe hesitating, saying, will this hurt us? And it's almost as if we're getting closer to the moment when people calculate that, right, it's more important to win the war than anything else. But we haven't quite got there. And I'm not sure what it is yet that's missing, but we're still not there.
But I think the solution presented by Hugo and by Ursula von der Leyen, which is a Ukraine recovery loan, I think it's a way to get to it.
Okay, I want to include Trey, who is the American on the panel, but I will first let Hugo Dixon speak because he's written about this. You can explain.
Yes, thank you very much, Anne. Thank you, Boris. Thank you, Gabriel. I do think this is actually a big breakthrough, Ursula von der Leyen's speech at the State of the Union just 2 days ago, where she backed the reparation loan idea. And this is very important. This is moving beyond confiscation, and this is coming up with an idea which is legally more solid and politically more acceptable. And the way that it works is, as Boris said, is that the Russian money is lent to Ukraine. Ukraine would repay the money with interest, but only if Russia pays reparations after the Claims Commission, which is being set up at the behest of the United Nations General Assembly, awards damages. Now, as far as the Belgians are concerned, there's a backstop. And Ursula von der Leyen mentioned this in her speech. She said there will be a backstop to make sure that the risk is shared. And Belgium is moving. You may have seen that on the morning of Ursula von der Leyen's speech, there was an article in the Financial Times where the Belgian finance minister said, well, we might be prepared to do something with this money provided that other countries share the risk with us. So things are moving. We're not there yet. And so what I would encourage everybody who wants the full 300 billion to go to Ukraine rather than the drip feed, which has kept it on life support for the last few years, but a real game changer, 300 billion. Get behind this scheme now that the European Commission is backing it, and let's get it out there as big as possible and as fast as possible, because speed is also of the essence. And I would just, slight plug, we have a website, Ukraine Reparation Loan, URL. And the faster we do this and the bigger we do this, the better. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugo. I'm now turning to Trey Yingst, who is the chief foreign correspondent for Fox. So first of all, an American view from this, and maybe for the room, your explanation of how this question is seen in Washington. And also, just before we started this panel, you said something very interesting to me about media pressure and the role that media can play in putting pressure on the Russians and in winning the war. So could you speak about both, please?
Absolutely. Look, this is a two-part issue. And the first part has to do with accountability for world leaders, both in Europe and the United States for when they say nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, they mean it. This is very important because there are a lot of statements made from our president. There are a lot of conversations that take place at a very high level in places like Paris earlier this month. But the large question that an audience has is, what does this mean in terms of action? And so that's part of our role on the ground as journalists, to make people care about Ukraine and make people care about the answers to these questions. Mr. Pinchuk said in an interview earlier this year, we need to tell this story as loudly and widely as possible. And I agree 100%. Because if people don't know what's happening here in Ukraine, they won't demand the answers to these questions. They won't demand solutions to these problems. And they won't put pressure on their governments to support Ukraine. They don't understand what's going on here. And so for the past 3.5 years, this has been part of our role on the ground, to go to places like Bucha, to show the mass graves following the war crimes that were committed against Ukrainian civilians, to go to Izum in the east of Ukraine, to the torture chambers there, to go to the front lines and speak with people like President Zelensky, to bring this story back, in our case, to an American audience, but for international journalists to their respective audiences. Because, again, there are a lot of conversations that take place at a very high level. From my perspective, the most important thing that we do as members of the media is not to get into the numbers and the conversations that are being had here today or in places like Paris, but it's to tell the stories of the individuals above me. Because if we can capture their faces and their stories, and we can make people thousands of miles away say, hey, those people have very similar values to me. They look just like me. They're fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters. Then we're able to keep Ukraine in the headlines. We're able to keep Ukraine at the tops of the minds of leaders around the world to find these solutions and answer these questions.
Out of curiosity, so one of the things that's happened in the US over the last few months, I just wrote about it last week, is the US is seeking to defund its foreign broadcasters. So this is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. You in Ukraine will know it. Voice of America. It's unclear now actually what will happen. They may be transformed into something else. It's not clear what the outcome will be. Have you thought about how it might be? You're a correspondent and spokesman. Have you thought about what would be a useful way to reach people in Russia? I mean, given the lessening of broadcasting in Russia, in Russian.
I think it's very important to remember that journalists on the ground in Ukraine, no matter if they're from the United States or from Europe, they are writing the first draft of history, a draft that the Russians constantly try to change. And this underscores just how important it is to be here on the ground. And when media outlets lose funding, when they don't have the ability to report here in Ukraine or they don't have the access, it creates a reality, especially for the Russians, that is often twisted, that is not what's actually happening here in Ukraine. And so we can turn to places like social media. Personally, this has been a very large focus of our reporting, going to the places that other people won't go to tell these stories, near the front lines, because it is crucial at this moment that we write that draft of history, an accurate draft. Because when journalists or media organizations lose the funding or the ability to tell these stories, it makes the conversations that we have in this room less impactful because people stop caring. They focus on places like the Middle East where there's a war going on right now. They look at natural disasters. They look at places like Nepal this week where there are serious world events that do require international attention. But they can forget about Ukraine. And so it's critical that we find every platform possible to reach an audience wherever they're at, to tell them the story of the Ukrainian people and Ukraine's fight for its survival.
Since we have such a broad panel, could I get all of you also to think for a moment about, this will sound overly bureaucratic, but the formats of Western cooperation. I mean, clearly, it's not quite the EU, it's not necessarily NATO when we're talking about economic pressure and political pressure. what is the ideal form that, you know, the people like all of you and your people who think similarly like you, how should you be working together? Because one of the things I've found most frustrating about the war is, you know, one country will take an action and then it will be vetoed by Hungary, or one country will fall behind on its messaging and others will keep up. And I feel there's this constant lack of coordination. Is the coalition of the willing the right format? Is that the right language? Is there something else? Is there something better? Any of you want to answer that?
What's wrong with NATO?
NATO doesn't do economics. I mean,
of course, it is a defensive alliance which is incredibly successful, and the President Trump, as far as I understand the matter, entrusted NATO with the task of collecting the cash for the weapons that he was going to sell, and he said that funding should come through NATO. NATO in the American, the White House says, has an absolutely core role in this, and that's a good thing. NATO is the transatlantic alliance, and it's the body that Ukraine wants to join. I would do it through NATO, through the North Atlantic Council. That's obvious to me. And look, I mean, I want to go back to the point I made earlier on. I can't stress if we want to get this war over, we need Putin to understand that strategically he's lost. He will continue to fight and he will continue to kill people if he thinks there's a chance that Ukraine can come back under the Russian umbrella or back into the Russian Empire. Once he understands that we're claiming it, that America is expressly claiming influence over Ukraine or expressly claiming, supporting Ukraine's demand to be included in Western security architecture, then he'll think again. But at the moment, the problem is still the problem it's always been since 1991, which is that we're ambiguous. We're ambiguous about what we think the final destiny of Ukraine is. And I've heard people today tell me there should be a sort of Finland solution. Who's saying that? Somebody was saying that to me earlier on. I can't remember where they are. No.
It wouldn't have been the Finnish president.
No,
that's for sure.
It wasn't actually. No, there shouldn't be a Finland solution because a Finland solution means Ukraine doesn't have sovereignty. Ukraine's got to be a free, sovereign, independent country.
Right. The trouble is that I agree, but the trouble is we don't have acceptance for that at the moment in Washington. Gabrielius, you wanted to say something.
Yes.
And we do have acceptance for that in Washington. We do because it's there in the text of the minerals agreement in the first or the second recital. It says that Ukraine is a free, exactly what I've just said. Ukraine is a free, sovereign, and independent country. That's what it says. So the Americans are formally committed to that. You can't be a free, sovereign, and independent country if another country can tell you which alliances you can join, right?
Sure.
So the Americans are already committed to the right answer. Let's hold them to it.
Gabrielius.
Holden is a very important word, I think, because we had to find the people who would be responsible for that. I remember when NATO was trying to figure out the name for an office in Kyiv. How would they call the NATO's support office? And I think that there were so many vetoes by the colleagues about what we can call the office and what we cannot, so that the decision was postponed for almost half a year until we decided the name. So kind of it tells a little bit of a story about where NATO is currently with the decisions about Ukraine. Now, coalition of the willing, that is a step in the right direction, but it lacks two words, able and ready. That means that there has to be a coalition, not just of people who are willing something, but who are ready to act and have the means to do that. Unfortunately, we're not there yet as well. So until, I believe that it's still some time while we figure out what, who in the political sphere can do what and are ready to do something. But on the other hand, I remember how French President Emmanuel Macron started his political path to the presidency. He started a political movement that was supposed to encompass the whole Europe, talking about the idea of Europe, what Europe actually needs. This has never happened, at least I wouldn't remember anybody else trying that. And I believe that this is what is needed today. There are a lot of people who care deeply about Ukraine, who do understand geopolitics, who do want Russia to be beaten and really leave us, alone. But I don't think it is still enough political pressure on those who make the decisions. So I would use the example of the pan-European movement to convince our decision makers today what needs to happen. That are those people who are in media, out of politics, in diplomacy, in businesses, that would combine in the movement, basically that would say that if we don't do this, Europe could be very well doomed. If we don't defend Ukraine, we might be next. And if we don't step up, this is it, to make it a point in the next election, to push, because there is no pressure. We're afraid that next election in France, the fringe forces will take power. No longer the center will hold. But I don't believe that it is heard really what is at stake. So there were good examples, and I think that we can repeat them.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. I've seen polling on the United States, and the clear majorities continue to support.
But it's not on the
Ukraine.
ballot. It's not on the ballot.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. This is related to what you were just saying. Do you want to add something?
Absolutely, and it comes down also from demanding clarity from world leadership about where they stand on Ukraine and what the next steps are in supporting Ukraine. This is something in the United States that has been a very slow but consistent issue spanning 2 administrations. And we saw that play out on the battlefield in the early days of the war. Ukraine would tell its allies what it needed, and it would take weeks and often months for those weapons to make it to Ukraine, whether it was anti-tank missiles, ultimately artillery, because the battlefield was changing in the east. But that's part of the issue today. Where do world leaders stand? And then the broader question, specifically as it relates to Europe, what more can European leaders do to put pressure on the Russian leader to come to the negotiating table and make a deal? And we saw those remarks from President Trump just last week following this summit in Paris, after the phone call that took place where 26 countries said they were willing to agree to a framework for a post-war support of Ukraine. But what was unclear at the time and still remains unclear is how those countries are going to support Ukraine before a ceasefire is reached, understanding that the Russian president has not acted in good faith at the negotiating table, whether it's in Istanbul or other locations. And so these are questions that have to be asked, and the positions of world leaders have to be clarified. Where does their support stand for Ukraine? And will they take these conversations that are taking place at a very high level and actually put them into action in the days and weeks ahead?
Gabriel.
No, I think these format issues are also important to convince the opinion. There will be a very interesting poll released tomorrow in France, which was actually ordered by the Yes Forum, a poll made after the Coalition of the Willing meeting that happened last week in Paris. When we asked French people in the polls, not that long ago, whether they were in favor or not sending troops for security guarantees, you had 2/3 of French people saying, no, we will never send troops, even for security guarantees after a ceasefire. A few months ago, I think it was still a majority of people, not that much, but still a majority of people saying we will not send troops. And for the first time, we have an 11-point majority of French people in this poll saying, yes, we are in favor of sending troops for security guarantees. Why? Because they saw all these leaders together in this coalition of the willing. So they understand that we will not go alone, we will be together. So I think people are sick of hearing that the EU can't get to an agreement because of
Hungary, right?
Because of Hungary, Slovakia, NATO can do everything, etc. So as my neighbor, I'm in favor of the coalition of the willing because I think these are steps forward, and it's also important for people's mind.
So you think that the polling in France was affected by the political events?
I'm sure about it, because they saw this image. They saw 35 countries together saying we will go together.
It sends a clear signal to a voter base. And like it or not, this is oftentimes the decision-making of world leaders. They understand they have elections coming up. And so where do their constituents stand when it comes to support for Ukraine? When there are meetings like this at a very high level that involve such a coalition of countries who say, enough, decisions are going to be made. And when they include President Trump in those conversations, as they did in Paris earlier this month with a phone call after the meeting, it sends a very clear message. And you have to believe that in Moscow they see this. They understand that in the future, maybe the Americans aren't going to have boots on the ground in Ukraine, but they have committed to things like air support, to support European partners who eventually will, as peacekeepers in this country, to ensure the sovereignty of Ukraine. And so I think it does send a very clear message, not just to their voter base and to the general public, but also to the Russians, that there is growing unity when it comes to support for Ukraine.
Boris wants to say.
Well, I just think it's very important that the timing of the arrival of the coalition of the willing should not be entirely controlled by Vladimir Putin, because he will put it off forever, right? And he will find a way of as I say, of not agreeing to any kind of ceasefire that allows us to do it. And therefore, it's perfectly obvious to me that we should get going now. And, you know, here we all are having a fantastic time in this hotel. We're safe as houses. Kyiv seems absolutely fine to me. Plenty of other parts of Ukraine seem very, very wonderful, a long way from the war. The coalition of the willing can ensconce themselves in lovely Ukrainian hotels for as long as it takes, and just demonstrate by their presence that it's up to Ukrainians to decide which troops come to Ukraine. And you know, at the moment, Putin is trying to veto that. Well, let's forestall all that nonsense and let's show where Ukraine stands in the Committee of Nations. That's the crucial thing. This is not about territory. This is about destiny. And we've got to show Ukrainians that we believe in their destiny. And one way to do that is to get going and deploy now. Why not?
We just have a few minutes left. This is very, very mean, and he is allowed to say no. But because there's no German on this panel, I see a senior German military figure in the room, and I wondered if he would like to comment. He's not. No. General, no? On the matter of coalition of the willing and putting pressure on Russia.
It's a very easy situation as I'm currently between two jobs, so I can't speak in any official capacity. And I think there are certain very convincing arguments Prime Minister made. I think if we come back where this war began and what's the reason for this war and what the Russians tried to tell us for the last 3.5 years, that they want to roll back not only Ukraine making their way to Europe, but also making the Baltic states having made already their way to Europe. We must be very clear that it's not only about Ukraine's sovereignty, but it's also about the sovereignty of nations which already have decided where their destiny lies.
Thank you. Thank you. And there's one other comment I will take, if you can be brief.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief because after 11 years of Russian aggression and Russian war, I think that we are still looking for...
Could you introduce yourself? Sorry.
Yeah, Maria Ionova, member of the Parliament, Foreign Affairs Committee, European Solidarity Political Force. And we are still looking for reasons why not to do. And it's about also Russian assets. That is why let's find the ways how to do it. And also not to be... not to react, but also to be proactive, and also to have the coalition not of willing, but capable and very decisive decisions. That is why when we see this attack on Poland, at least the reaction is all economic sanctions, all long-range missiles, or at least the decision of NATO countries that we have, that NATO countries has to supervise the western flank of Europe and to help our Ukrainian air defense to hit Russian missiles. That is why my question is, what are the red lines? 19 drones, 20 drones, 15 drones to get the actions? Thank you.
All right. Those who would like to make a final comment are welcome. Gabrielius.
Well, I think that was a very important point. I mentioned that at the beginning in my initial remark that Putin is testing NATO and actually testing the coalition of the willing. If he's no longer afraid to enter Poland with drones, what makes us sure that he will not attack Polish or German or French troops who will be stationed in Ukraine if they're always on the back foot, not ready to fight forward? So how do we change that? So that means that we fight forward. So how do we fight forward? And then I'll follow Anne's example and, call our German friends. There's a missile, Taurus. That would be a tremendously welcome sign today. You attack Poland? Well, this is a missile. We give that to the Ukrainians, and tomorrow they will attack you, where you launch your drones onto Ukraine and onto Poland.
Trey, last word.
I also think looking at the reality of the situation is important and demanding that leaders around the world look at the reality of the situation. The incident in Poland earlier this week is a perfect example. It's very easy when people are at the negotiating table or they believe there is some momentum in conversations to say that may have been an accident. Or as General Kellogg said on an earlier panel as it related to that American company in Western Ukraine that was targeted by Russian missiles, many world leaders left the incident ambiguous. General Kellogg rightly said, as a man who understood it targeting, that this was a facility that was targeted because it was a private American company in Western Ukraine. So as it relates to that incident and the drone incident in Poland earlier this week, it's critical that world leaders look at the situation on the ground as it is, not as they want it to be. And generals and those who have written about war often say, we must look at the battlefield as it is, not as we want it to be. And that's critical, that world leaders look at the attacks that are taking place and the expansion of Russian attacks as they are.
Thank you.
I would give the Taurus anyway. Why wait? Why wait?
You can have a... Thank you very much. I think everyone said what they think.